Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashtarothi, the voice of New Eden, and today we are talking about how to play EVE Online in 2025 Turrets Edition. EVE Online is an incredible space game, and at some point, most players will encounter another person or another ship and feel like causing spontaneous deconstruction of their hull, i.e. blow them up. And the various weapon systems in the game are used in order to do just that. There are two major kinds of weapon systems in EVE, turret systems and missile systems, and each of them operate with their own mechanics. However, today we are going to be discussing the far more commonly used one throughout all of the empires, turrets. Turrets are, as I said, a very important piece to the weapon systems of EVE Online. All four major empires use turrets, and turrets are the probabilistic weapon system, i.e. there is probability built into it, as we'll look into. So today we are going to be talking about the mechanics of turrets, the kinds of turrets, and how to affect those turrets, i.e. ammunition, skills, piloting, etc. First, let's talk about turret mechanics just broadly. Turrets, as I mentioned, are a probabilistic system. They operate around this 1 through 100 chance. So you could say that every single time a turret shoots, it rolls a 100-sided die, and it generates a number based on that. And that's how it creates both its damage and its chance to hit. We can come here to the EVE University website where there is turret mechanics, and we can look into the fact that there are two different pieces of information that are relevant to how hard and how likely we are to hit. The first is range, and the second is tracking. Range is divided into two different stats. One is optimal range, and the other is fall off. Now, for the purposes of this, we got to assume that the target is not moving in any way. That's tracking. We'll get to that in a second. But optimal range represents how far away a target can be, assuming it is, I like to say, a broadside of a barn. A large, unmoving target. Optimal range is the furthest you will have a 100% chance to hit that target. The fall off is the distance it takes per standard deviation from that optimal. So optimal plus single fall off is the amount of distance it takes for you to hit 50% chance to hit that broadside of a barn. And the second fall off, that accuracy is reduced to about a little less than 6%. Or sorry, a little bit over 6%, 6.25% at second fall off. Pretty much by your second fall off, you're already not able to hit the opponent at all. Now, that's only half of the equation. The other piece of it is tracking. Tracking is how fast your turret's guns can actually physically move. So you've got this ship that's going across your horizon. It's traveling around your ship, and as it travels, the turret has to keep up. If the ship is traveling around your ship fast enough, your turret won't be able to keep up, and it won't be able to track. Here's some videos from the EVE Academy website, which is another very good website. We can see turret fall off starts at first fall off, it's 100% chance to hit. As it travels to your optimal plus fall off, it'll reduce to 50% chance to hit. And then at second fall off, it'll be at 6.25 chance to hit, and it'll go down from there. Beyond first fall off, your chances quickly fade to basically zero. Tracking allows us to keep track of a ship that's going around, how well our turrets stay up to speed with that ship. So if a ship is going faster than our weapons can track, then it can often avoid the damage that we are trying to do. What it's pointing out here is this is how fast it goes across your horizon. A ship that is closer to you, traveling at the same speed, will have a higher what's called angular velocity, how fast it's going across your horizon. Whereas a ship that is going the same speed further away, because it's further away, will be going slower as far as angular velocity goes, right? That's just how angles work. It has to travel further to go the entire 360 degrees. It has to go faster to maintain the same angular velocity. The optimal range and your tracking are both put together to generate a single number, which is your percent chance to miss. And this is important because unlike a lot of other video games or other games where the chance to hit and the chance to damage are two different rolls, right? Like in Dungeons & Dragons, you'll roll the hit, and if you hit, then you'll roll a different number to damage. In Eve, that doesn't work. It's the same roll. So if we scroll down here, we can see basically you roll a 100-sided die. If you roll a 2 through 12 and a half, then it'll count as a grazing blow. So if you roll a die, you get a 10. It's going to add 49 to it because you take your random number, which is X. If X is greater than 0.01, then it adds 0.49 to it, and that's your total damage modifier. We'll talk about what happens if it rolls a 1 next. That's a crit. If it rolls a 10, then it 10 plus 0.49, so it's going to do 59 points of damage. Close. So if you roll 20, it'll give you 69% of the total damage. Nice. If you roll a 10, it'll say grazes, and will do 60% or 59% of the total damage that the turret says it's going to do. If you roll a 69, then it'll say glances. Or sorry, if you roll a 19 or 20 rather, it'll say glances and do 69% of your total damage. If you roll a 90, then it'll say smashes and will do 140% of the total damage. So you can actually do more than the listed damage on the turrets. That's why when things are going well, you actually can be doing more DPS with a turret than it even says it can do on paper. Because the roll, when you look at the damage of the turret, it can fluctuate from 50% to 150% per shot. Now, this is happening on a per individual turret basis. So if you take multiple turrets and you stack them together, they will roll these rolls individually, but then lump them all together into one specific stat and then give you the results of that stat. So the practical upshot of this is that, let's say I have 3 turrets, 2 of them roll a hit. I roll 2 40s and a miss. It's going to take that miss, which is 0 damage, and then it's going to take those 2 90% hits. So even though it says 90% hit, we can see 90% plus 90%, 180%, plus 0, 180%, divided by 3 is 60%. So it's actually going to report a grazing blow, even though the 2 hits that did hit are actually doing hits. So none of the 3 shots did a grazing blow, and yet the combined report of all 3 turrets is a grazing shot. So how do these two things factor in with each other? Well, this chart, smashes, penetrates, hits, glances off, grazes. What you do is you take your percentage chance to miss and you cover up the top of the chart, which at this point is the bottom of the chart for this one. So if you have, let's see, a smashes is anything from, looks like 75%. If you roll a 75 or above, you're going to get a smashing hit. Yes, this is our very nerdy stuff. This is the deep level understanding of this sort of stuff. Let's say if I roll from 75 to 100, I get a smashing blow. But let's say I have a 25% chance to miss, either because of them being further than my optimal or because my tracking is having difficulty, whatever it is. I have a 25% chance to miss. That means any hit that will be a smashing blow will instead be a miss. So if it rolls a 50%, it'll be like, okay, great, you hit. If it rolls a 60%, it'll be like, all right, great, you penetrate. If it rolls a 90%, it'll be like, you miss. So that's where misses come from. So in that previous explanation I just gave you, with 2 of them rolling 40s and 1 of them missing, it could very well be that I had a 15% chance to miss, and I rolled a 40, and a 90, which would give me a 90% damage, 90% damage, and a miss, which total gives me about a 60% hit or a grazing blow for all 3 of those turrets if you lump them together. So what this means is if you have a bunch of turrets, you will see, if you're hitting well, you should see more smashing, and if you are hitting worse, you're going to see more grazing. This doesn't mean that there's more grazing blows happening, 12.5% of all of your shots are going to be a grazing blow. But because we're lumping the damage together, any shots that include misses are much, much, much more likely to report grazing blows because you're averaging that 0% in when the minimum that any shot can normally do is 51% damage. If you roll a 1, that is a critical hit. If we go back up to this chart, we can see if X is less than 1, then it is considered a wrecking shot. And a wrecking shot does double the maximum damage, which means a wrecking shot does 300% of the normal damage, not 200, because remember the maximum damage that a normal turret can run. If you roll a 100, you do 150% damage. So a wrecking shot does 300% the normal damage. The only way you can get rid of wrecking shots is reducing the chance to hit you to below 1%. As long as you've at least 1% chance to hit, then you have a 1% chance to wreck. This is something that is pretty dangerous, especially when it comes to NPC turrets, because often NPC turrets will actually be calculated as one giant turret. One of the really good examples of this is like the Drifter battleship in the Abyss. It has a shot that's a single shot that's a lot of damage. So you can make it so that the battleship, it's designed so that way you try to make it so the battleship almost can never hit you. But almost never isn't the same as never. And because of the chance to hit you is so low, if it does hit you, chances are it's going to be a wrecking shot. So that's how you get those NPCs that suddenly just completely wipe out your hit points. You have a 1% chance each shot of just getting wrecked. However, if you as a pilot often have multiple turrets in your rack that are all shooting at the same time. Remember, it combines them all together and then consults this chart to see where you're at on the chart. So if you get a bunch of normal blows, so that way it would be on average a hit, for example, but one of the shots is a wrecking shot, in the same way that a miss is going to pull your average down to report a graze when it wasn't, so too will a wrecking shot report a smashing or a penetrate when it's not. So this is why, even though that there is the exact same amount of chance of getting a glancing blow or a grazes, if you have a high % chance to hit versus a low % chance to hit, you're still got just as much chance of rolling a 12 either way, 12 or below. When you combine them all, misses make your shots look more like grazes, and crits make your shots look more like smashes. You can monitor how well your shots are doing that way. And if you want to monitor them more closely, you can always split your rack and watch the turrets shoot individually to see whether or not you're missing, how often you're missing, etc. This is also why Triglavian weapons, which use only one turret at a time, we'll be talking about the different turrets later, they feel so much more impactful when it comes to wrecking shots. Firstly, they see wrecking shots more often than any other ship. A ship with 4 turrets is going to see the report of a wrecking shot a quarter of the time as a ship with only 1 turret. Because in order for that ship with 4 turrets to register a wrecking shot, you have to get a 1% chance on all 4 turrets. So that's like 1 in 10,000, I think, chance off the top of my head of actually seeing a wrecking shot. Whereas a wrecking shot with a Triglavian ship is going to be a 1 in 100 chance. So you're going to see them a lot more. In fact, the chances of you seeing a single wrecking shot with that weapon, with that ship with 4 turrets, is the same chance as seeing 4 wrecking shots in a row with a Triglavian ship. So this is one of the reasons why people perceive these things differently. Is it 1 in a million? There you go. The other piece to that is when a Triglavian ship does a wrecking shot, it's effectively wrecking with the entire rack. Whereas obviously to wreck with the entire rack with a normal ship, you have each of those individual turrets have to get a wrecking blow. So it's a little bit different, but we'll talk about the individual turrets when we get there. I just want people to understand the mechanics of turrets very, very thoroughly before we start talking about the different kinds of turrets and what they do. Because the turrets you choose and the ammo you choose for those turrets affect these numbers, both damage and application. With all that said, let's look at the different turrets that we have available. Each of the 4 races have their own turret system, sort of, actually. Each of the 4 races has a turret weapon system. However, the Gallente and the Caldari, both originating from the same source and having the same fundamentals of technology, both use the same turret system. And then, of course, the Triglavians, being the special snowflake race, have their own turret system. So there's 4 turret systems, 3 for the primary empires, and then the Triglavian weapon system. Right here, I have what's called a Praxis battleship. The Praxis battleship is pretty unique in the fact that it doesn't require skills to fly. We can see here the requirements to fly this ship is Spaceship Command 1. No other skills are required to fly this, no other battleship skills or anything like that. And the other thing that is nice about it is that it has roll bonuses for every single turret type or weapon system type in the game. So this can be used with any weapon system equally good without requiring any skills. So we're going to just use this as a comparison tool for today. And we see, if we go into our fitting tools, we sort by high slots and we come down, we see that there are energy weapons, hybrid weapons, projectile weapons, and precursor turrets. Those are the types of turrets: energy, hybrid, projectiles, and precursor. Energy and projectile are basically opposites of each other. The Amarian people are focused on energy turrets, where they have very far optimal range, pretty good tracking, but a very, very short fall off. So we can see Mega Pulse Laser 2. We can see here that this thing has a rate of fire of once every 6 seconds. It has an optimal range of 31 kilometers. That's with my skills. So it has a base of 25 kilometers and a fall off of 12 kilometers. So 31 kilometer optimal, 12 kilometer fall off, but the base is actually 25 optimal, 10 fall off. But if I go to the opposite, if we go to projectile turrets and we grab an autocannon, so if I look at this one, I can see that it has an optimal range of 6,000 with a base of 4,800 and an accuracy fall off of 25k with a base value of 20k. You can see already the optimal for the lasers, they have a much further optimal. In fact, we can go to the compare tool. We can see that the fall off and optimal range are basically opposites of each other. Not totally, but close. The autocannon has a very long fall off and a very short optimal range, whereas the laser has a very long optimal range and a very short fall off. The other piece to this that is maybe more difficult, like is harder to suss out on all this, is the reload speed, which is important. So we can see that the reload time for the autocannon is 10 seconds, whereas the reload time of the laser is 0 seconds. It's instant. This is important. So all these things come together in how these two weapon systems fight. With an autocannon, you are almost never going to be at your optimal range. You have such a far fall off and such a close optimal range. Chances are you're going to be fighting somewhere in your fall off, which isn't actually all that bad. It does mean that you have some chance to miss, but the other piece to note in this is the tracking. We can see that the autocannon has a much higher tracking than the laser pulse rifle, right? A mega pulse laser. Now, this is actually because this mega pulse laser is designed to be able to track at 25 kilometers. That's its optimal range. Whereas the repeating autocannon is designed to fight at 5 kilometers. That's its optimal range. Remember, we talked about earlier, the closer something is, the faster its angular velocity compared to its actual velocity. So the higher the tracking is going to need to be. So what this means is because the Mimitar pilot with his repeating autocannon usually fights in fall off, it actually means that he has a relatively good chance to hit. His hits will degrade as it gets closer and closer to his fall off. So there's a broad range of engagement with the Mimitar pilot. He's able to engage from basically 5 kilometers all the way up to 25 kilometers. It's a balancing act between tracking and range. The closer you are, the better off you are, but you're still hitting just fine all the way up to 2,500. It's just you're somewhere in that range. What's important here is that changing ammunition, i.e. changing what that turret is good at, takes a long time. It takes 10 seconds. So whatever you're stuck with, whatever your ammo you've chosen, you're pretty much stuck with that during the engagement, and changing your ammo is a big cost. Whereas with lasers, it has a very specific optimal and a short fall off. Now, this 10 kilometers may not seem like that short of a fall off, but smaller weapons have a smaller fall off, and all things considered, it is a pretty quick fall off. A good example, actually, a better example would be if we go to like the smaller weapon systems and we see pulse laser. We can say small focus pulse laser. We'll see that its fall off is 2,500 meters. So this thing is going to, it's going to be fine, all the way up to 6,000 kilometers. So it's going to get up to 6,000 kilometers. And then within 2 more kilometers, it's going to basically have fallen off. So lasers want to be at their optimal a lot more. And so as such, they have ammunition that changes out every second, or in 1 second rather, because the different crystals that lasers use affects its optimal range. So whereas a Minmatar pilot will attempt to adjust their range in order to be able to hit better, but has some flexibility in their range based on their long fall off, a Amarr pilot will likely be, as they change range, turning off their weapon system and changing out their crystal to change where their optimal range is to maximize the amount of damage they're doing for the same amount of optimal range. That kind of is just one way in which lasers and projectile turrets are opposites of each other. Another way that they are opposite of each other is in cap cost. So we can see capacitor is like mana in Eve. It's how your ships do things. Pretty much most modules require some amount of capacitor to run, and lasers are no exception. In fact, lasers take quite a bit of capacitor. This mega pulse laser takes 36 gigajoules per shot, whereas autocannons do not take any capacitor to shoot. You can completely cap out a Minmatar ship that's using autocannons, and they will continue to shoot into your face no matter what, as long as they have bullets, because it doesn't cost them any capacitor to do so. Lasers have good optimal range, short fall off, good application and damage. In fact, we can even see damage-wise. Damage modifier. The damage modifier on the laser is also higher than the autocannon, so it has a higher top damage. But remember, the laser is much more precise as to how it applies that damage and requires you to switch out to the correct crystal in order to do it, whereas the projectile damage has a much more likely to do whatever it manages to get done. It's much more consistent, but not as optimal as the lasers are, if that makes sense. The third type of turret, the third main type of turret, is blasters, or hybrid turrets, rather. Hybrid turrets are in between lasers and projectiles. So if I look at this with neutron blasters, I can see that my damage modifier, well, actually, on the one hand, hybrids are in between the Amarr and the Minmatar, or the projectiles and the lasers. But on the other hand, hybrids are also the most extreme of the turrets. The short range, that's actually something I forgot to mention. Almost every weapon system, besides the specialty weapon systems, have a short range and a long range weapon version. So for lasers, we have pulse lasers, which is what we've been talking about, but we also have beam weapons. With projectiles, we have autocannons, which are the short range, but then we also have artillery. And then for hybrids, we have blasters and rails. The long-range weapon systems have their own unique properties, so we'll talk about those in a second, but the spoiler, I guess, is that hybrids have the most extreme ranges in the game. The short-range hybrid weapon system is the Shotgun of Eve. Very short range, very, very high damage. Whereas the railguns are the longest range weapon system in Eve, the most snipery of all of them. So we'll get to long range weapons in a second. We're looking at blasters right now. So just looking at this blaster, we can see that it has a reload time that's halfway between the lasers and the autocannons. It has a cost. It does have a capacitor cost at 12.74 gigajoules, but that's not as high as the 36 gigajoules, but obviously more than the 0 gigajoules of autocannons. It has an accuracy fall off of 10 kilometers and an optimal range of 7.5 kilometers. Again, this is very, very short range. It's actually not as short range as the repeating cannon. The repeating cannon has a 4,800 meter optimal range. 7,200 is less than that. But if we combine the two, we see 7,200 plus 10K is 17K. That's let's call that the engagement profile of this weapon system before skills. 17k, so that's up to first fall off. Whereas with the autocannon, it leads up to 25k. So the autocannons have a shorter optimal range, but an overall longer engagement profile than even blasters do. That's why we say that blasters are the shortest range weapon system in the game, because oftentimes repeating cannons aren't operating at their optimal. They're operating somewhere in their fall off. They're designed to. But as a result, we see that the blasters have a much higher tracking than even the repeating cannons. Hopefully this will make it a little bit easier to read for you guys. So we can see blasters, highest damage, shortest range, good tracking, does use capacitor, takes 5 seconds to reload. And then finally, there is one last type of weapon system, one that I cannot put on the Praxis, but we will go and look at it, and that is precursor turrets, Entropic Disintegrators. So we're going to take the Entropic Disintegrator. Now, the Entropic Disintegrator doesn't have a long-range weapon system and a short-range weapon system. They only have the one weapon system. It has an optimal range of 28 kilometers. But if you look, the Entropic Disintegrator has no fall-off. This is what makes them unique as a turret system. The Entropic Disintegrators use the exact same turret mechanics as normal turrets in every way except for fall-off. If you hit the optimal range of a Triglavian turret, if you go past that, it doesn't miss, it shuts off completely. You have to get back into range and begin attacking again for it to continue to do damage. Other things to note about it. It has the highest activation cost in the game. Why is this that way? Because Triglavian ships only use one gun, whereas almost all, every other ship uses more than one turret. A mega pulse laser may only take 36 gigajoules, but if you have more than two of them, then you're spending more capacitor per shot cycle than you will with the Entropic Disintegrator. It's also why the Entropic Disintegrator gun is so much more expensive than a standard turret, because this one turret represents an entire rack of weapons. Yeah, so that's the other thing that's important about the Triglavian turrets, which is that they have a thing that is called damage multiplier bonus and damage multiplier maximum. You can see here that none of the other turrets have this system. This is a Triglavian only turret system. Every successful cycle, it does not matter if you miss or hit, every successful cycle will increase the amount of damage that it is doing. So in this case, it starts relatively low at only basically 0.96 times damage, but every cycle it increases by 7% until it ends up at 212% its base damage. So a little more than double its base damage per cycle. Now, this is why it has no fall off. If the disintegrator shuts off for any reason, this ramp also resets. The whole point of a Triglavian system, it's got more of a demand on piloting. With a laser system, if I let them get a little bit too far away, it's fine. I just get back into range, or I change out my crystals and I'm good to go. But with the Entropic Disintegrator, if I let them get out of range, I restart my ramp completely, which can be a big deal. So it takes a little bit more piloting finesse to pilot Triglavian ships well, and this is why. That is exactly why trig ships are used for structure bashing, because within about a minute or so, trig ships are often able to do significantly more damage than their counterparts. And because the thing isn't moving, you can just make sure to sit there and just burr on them using maximum damage. If we look a little bit more practical, if we look at like battleships, right? Yeah, this thing doesn't have any drones. And with standard antimatter, it's going to do 776 damage. This Triglavian ship, even with its damage bonuses, if I remove drones and put in their short-range weapon system, can see it's 589 DPS. So Triglavian ships will start with a lower starting damage, but if they're allowed to ramp up, then they can do extremely high ongoing damage once it can ramp up. So they're particularly good at destroying structures because of this, or in general punching up. This is why things like Kikimoras are good at killing battleships or whatever. In fact, I was going to start today with a scenario, which is you're out there trying to do your missions. You've got your battleship with your big weapons, and then a Nergal comes in and goes suspect by attacking your stuff. And you're like, that Nergal, it's just a frigate. It's a tiny little thing. I'm a giant battleship. I'm big and scary. There's no way this little thing is going to be able to get me. So you decide to shoot at it. And by shooting at it, you allow it to now shoot at you. And 10 minutes later, 10 very frustrating minutes later, you are blown up and the Nergal is fine. What really happened here? The problem that we have here is that this Nergal is going to be going fast enough and it's small enough that your giant guns with terrible tracking can't hit it. The Nergal has a turret that can ramp up. In fact, the Nergal, you can see here, has a bonus that says that it can actually increase the maximum that it can ramp. This ship can actually ramp higher than even other Triglavian ships. By the time that 10 minutes is over, this Nergal is doing an incredible, way more damage than you would expect from a frigate against that battleship, and the battleship simply cannot kill the Nergal. Yeah, I did mention signature, like it's smaller, which is signature radius. Signature radius does make it easier to hit, but this being a frigate is so small that it is hard to hit. This is why you should never trust a Nergal in high sec. The last significant thing that we need to focus on. So we've got turret mechanics, we've got tracking, we've got range. And like I said, signature radius impacts in the fact that a bigger signature radius makes it easier to hit, because if you think about it, if something's moving quickly, but it's huge, you're still going to have an easier time hitting it until it's going so much faster than your tracking that your guns literally just can't keep up at all. You know, likewise, if something's very far away, but it's big, it's going to be easier to hit. But the main thing that affects all of these turrets that we haven't talked about is ammunition. And the reason why we haven't talked about this is because ammunition affects things in different ways. Before we talk about ammunition, I forgot, we need to talk about long-range weapon systems. We've talked about all those short-range weapon systems. Signature radius also affects lock time, which can be the basis of entire fight on first salvo advantage. That's absolutely true. The smaller the signature radius, the longer it takes to lock them, and you can't shoot what you haven't locked yet. That is a very good point. We've been over the short-range weapon systems, right? The blaster, the autocannon, and the pulse laser. The long-range weapon systems, each one of them, I like to think of it as what it is that they're good at. So the long-range weapon system, the hybrids, as we've already talked about, is the longest range of the long-range weapon systems. Here, let's go back here and look for tachyon laser versus 150 millimeter railgun 2s versus 1400 howitzer artillery. By the way, there are multiple types within a single category. The best example of this, the easiest to remember, is like for blasters. Each one has an ion, a neutron, and an electron. If we put these all in compare tool, these are all the same category of ship or weapon. All three of these weapons are medium blasters, but we can see here that there's a relationship between tracking, cost, and damage in the fact that as things get bigger, so like the neutrons are the heaviest ones. They take the most CPU and power grid. They do the most damage. They shoot the furthest, but they have the slowest tracking. They're big and clunky. Whereas electrons are the fastest and the lowest resources, but the shortest range and the lowest amount of damage multiplier of these three. So when you have like medium blasters, you can have neutrons, ions, or electrons based on how much fitting room you have, etc., etc. When I've been doing the comparisons today, I've been trying to compare with the heaviest of each category. I might have made some mistakes. Somebody can correct me down below if I have. But just remember that there are multiple turrets per size category. And the best way to tell between them is I just take the Tech 2 of all of them, and then I compare them like this. It's like, oh, well, electron blasters. So then I show info, and then I can say variations, and then here are all the versions of the medium electron blaster, just in case I need something like that. But we're talking about long-range weapon systems now. We have beam lasers, rail guns, and we have artillery. And the main differences here is, first of all, a lot of it does stay the same. Like if we look at optimal range and fall off, we'll see that the railgun, this is not the right railgun. I knew that number seemed low. We're going to go with 425s instead of 125s. We can see here that the beam laser has a long optimal range and a short fall off, whereas the artillery have a shorter optimal range but a longer fall off. This gets adjusted quite a bit because a shorter optimal range in this case is 48 kilometers away, but it's still true. You can see that the projectile turrets do have a shorter optimal and a longer fall off, whereas lasers have a longer optimal and a shorter fall off. But in this case, whereas with the blasters before, The blasters were a super short-range weapon system. Railguns are a super long-range weapon system. So they have the furthest optimal range and a pretty good fall-off for what it is. Not as far of a fall-off as artillery, but, you know, whatever. So railguns are the furthest shooting weapon system in the game. You want extreme ranges, railguns will get you there. Lasers have the best application. So we can see, tracking-wise, the lasers are going to have the best tracking by a pretty significant margin at 1.4 versus 1.16 or 0.9. So the tachyon beam lasers have a really good tracking and a really good damage multiplier. So this is a big thing about lasers, is that lasers are good at projecting damage. They don't necessarily have the highest potential damage. They don't necessarily have the best range, but they do have the best damage for their range. The beam lasers are going to have the best tracking of most of the long-range weapon systems. The railgun is going to be the furthest shooting. So what makes the artillery so special? Well, wait a minute. I just said that 5.4 is a good damage multiplier. Look at this damage multiplier on the artillery. 12.8. Holy crap. Why is that possible? Well, let's look at the rate of fire. The rate of fire, how fast it cycles, we can see that the rate of fire for a beam laser is 12 seconds. Now, remember, all of these get adjusted by skills. The railgun has a fire rate of 8 seconds, but the howitzer artillery has a fire rate of 40 seconds. So let's think about this. They all have roughly the same DPS, damage per second, but you're going to shoot the beam laser 3 times for every once that you're shooting the howitzer, and the railgun, you're shooting at least 4 or 5 times for every time that you shoot the artillery gun, which means when the artillery shoots, it's hitting for 2 to 5 times harder than either of these other weapon systems. Because whereas like a blaster cycles over and over and over again. It's cycling like every second and a half. It's just bam, 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 bam. So each individual shot is not doing as much damage. But the howitzer is doing 40 seconds of damage instantly. We call this alpha strike, the amount of damage that it is doing in a single individual shot. So we can see here, if we give these things all ammunition, so if I put fusion in this, and if I put, let's call it antimatter in that, and let's put multi-frequency in this laser is doing an alpha strike of 500 damage and 55.9 DPS. If we switch to this one, we're doing 56.6 DPS, so almost the same amount of DPS, but 338 alpha strike. Lower alpha strike, same DPS, because it cycles faster. It's doing a lower amount of damage more often. This thing's shooting every 5.85 seconds, as opposed to the laser, which is firing every 9 seconds. So then if we go to artillery, we see less DPS. It's not 56.6. It is 40.6, but look at that alpha strike, baby. 1,200 alpha strike from this one turret. So this one turret has 2 to 3 times the alpha strike as any other weapon system. What this means is, if you want to fire at something that's an insane amount of distance away, let's say a target is 200 kilometers away. I think the maximum lock range is what, 230? So you want to kill something that's over 100 kilometers away, for example. You're probably going to want this railgun, because the railgun is going to shoot. Look, this is the short range ammo system, and it's shooting 66 kilometers before it hits first fall off. This thing actually shoots further before first fall off, but that's because it's also using a different ammo system. Ammo's a little, we're going to get to ammo in a second. If we really want to snipe, we can take the long range ammo system, or ammo. And we can see here that this turret, now with no other assistance, is firing at 130 optimal with 160 fall off. Even with the best ammo that I can possibly get for this guy, this thing is only doing this thing is going 108 to 152. This thing can shoot at somebody within 130 kilometers of it, and it's still in its optimal. Whereas with the artillery, it's going to be halfway through fall off. So if you need to snipe somebody very far away, you're going to be using rails. But if you want to kill them real fast, you're going to want to use artilleries. Also, if you want to maximize the amount of damage that you're going to be doing, you're going to want to go with the blasters, right? Because blasters are the highest damage dealing weapon system just off the cuff. So if we go with like a neutron blaster cannon and we put Void in it, which is the short range advanced ammo, we're seeing that this thing does 106 DPS, whereas these other ones do what, 27 DPS for the long range ammo there, 38 DPS for the long range ammo there, 100 DPS. We can even compare it to other short range weapon systems. It's still going to be the best. This is why we see the ships that we see used in ganking. If you're going to try to snipe somebody from really far away, if you're going to try to hit somebody from further than they can hit you, that's why we see a lot of Nagas and Feroxes and Roks, especially in like fleet fights where I can make up for the anemic damage of these weapon systems by just adding in numbers, right? That's why Roke fleets are really, really good, is because Roke fleets can shoot somebody from like 120 kilometers away and peg them, whereas most other weapon systems won't even be able to reach that far. So if you're not a rail system, you're not going to be hitting them. Is it also higher in Alpha Strike? Which one? The artillery are going to be the highest Alpha Strike. If you're going to see somebody trying to out-snipe you, you're going to see them in rail guns, mostly in Caldari ships, because Caldari have good range bonuses and are designed around using rail guns. By the way, Gallente and the Caldari share hybrids. That's the piece that I forgot to mention. The last one I added, the blasters. The blasters actually have a very low alpha strike because they have such a fast cycle time. If we turn off the other weapon systems, we can see that it has an alpha strike of 600, which may seem like a lot, but remember, this is like the most damaging weapon system in the game compared to, so this is firing at something from 6 kilometers to 13 kilometers, whereas all these other ones that we're talking about are like 70 kilometers. So there's a big difference there. It still has half the alpha strike. This artillery cannon can hit somebody at 108 kilometers with the same alpha strike as this blaster hits at 6 kilometers. That's the difference between these two weapon systems. Does that make sense? If you're trying to snipe somebody, so like you're gate camping, or you're trying to protect a particular site, or you're fighting over a structure, so you've got a big range of range to be engaging at, and your goal is to engage your opponent further away than they can engage you, railguns, super fucking useful. And so we see them in Ferox fleets, in Naga fleets, in Roke fleets. Artillery has this extremely high alpha damage, which means we see it in a lot of gank fleets, tornadoes, hurricanes, but mostly tornadoes. This is why NATOs, and to a certain extent things like Thrashers, are used for suicide ganking. Tornadoes are great for high-sec ganking, correct. But it's not just high-sec ganking. It's any time that you want to have an extremely high alpha strike, which has two different opportunities. The first is you want to be able to kill them before anybody can do anything. The nice thing about having such a high alpha strike with suicide ganking is that often you can blow up their ship before they even get their hardeners on. If you get them the second that they appear, then boom, they're dead and they don't even get their hardeners on. You can just cut straight through them. And it's of course before Concord shows up. That's true. But you're really trying to get them before they can get any of their normal defenses online. You're just trying to hit them before. If you've ever hit warp and instantly exploded and didn't know why, chances are there is a tornado waiting to pop you. And this is how they did it. The other thing that it is useful for in fleet fights is a lot of fleets use logistics, and logistics takes time to respond. They need to lock the person that's the target. They need to start reps, depending on if it's shield or armor, depends on how long it takes to get those reps on field. We're going to talk more about armor versus shields in another episode, but the goal here is if you have, let's say, an entire fleet of Macarials. This is one of the reasons why Macarials are very popular as a fleet doctrine. You're not going to shoot quite as far as those railgun guys. You're going to engage within about, usually it's like 60 to 80 kilometer engagement range for your artillery. But the nice thing is, what you'll hear is the FC will be like, lock up these guys, fire in 3, 2, 1, fire. Because the goal is to have everybody shoot at the exact same time, maximizing that alpha strike. Your goal is to try to kill the ship before reps are even able to land, thereby completely mitigating their logistics completely. That's the point of artillery. It's why you use artillery. It's because you want to front load a crap ton of damage right away. Meanwhile, if you just want to maximize the amount of damage that you do total, and range is no issue. So for instance, the goal is to kill them before the second shot is fired. That's correct. But let's say you are trying to kill a mining barge. You're trying to suicide gank a mining barge in high sec. They have some defenses. You don't need an alpha strike because you've got them, right? You've got 20 seconds or whatever until Concord shows up. but you need to be able to do the most amount of damage as possible. Well, that's where blasters come in. This is why we see a lot of catalysts. If you ever hear about people ganking things in high sec, a lot of those ganking ships are catalysts. It's because catalysts are cheap blaster boats. They bring the most amount of blaster damage available on as cheap of a hull as it is. And so it maximizes the total amount of damage that you can get done, the maximum DPS you can do to a target, assuming that you can be on top of it, which is one of the reasons why moving is such a good defense. Just simply moving, like orbiting or whatever, just continually being in motion is a big defense against suicide ganking, because those blasters really rely on being directly on top of you in order to maximize their application. And then, of course, lasers are much more precision based. A lot of ships that are good at kiting and try to operate and kite at long ranges will end up using beam ships. That's why we see things like slicers and Omen Navy issues and that kind of stuff operate the way that they do. They're fast and they're able to stay at longer range, but in comparison to what you're used to seeing as far as longer range weapon systems are concerned, lasers are much better at actually applying their damage to their enemy target, which makes them very good for solo skirmishers, as opposed to rails and artillery, which, if you notice in both of the scenarios that I talked about how those get used, they're used in fleets to compensate for low damage. That's true. Catalyst for lower end ships. It's also why you see Taloses for larger, like a lot of freighter ganks, because freighters are all about how much damage you can burn through. So you're going to see Taloses and even Gnosis, larger blaster platforms, are going to be used to try to cut through those gigantic freighter hit points before Concord's able to stop you. We've talked about a lot of this stuff about the differences between weapon systems. We've talked about what helps you hit versus damage. Now we're going to put all that information to use to talk about the kind of ammunition that you can have. In order to get information about ammunition, I actually strongly recommend, I have a page on my Convocation Notion about infographics that include turret identification and different weapon systems and how they compare. You have projectile, energy, hybrid, and disintegrators. In each of these charts, we have range. So further right on this chart represents ammo that shoots further. And further up on the chart is better tracking. Further down on this chart is worse tracking. A couple things we can get out of this, which is that in general, the further the weapon system is, the less damage it does. And we can see, if we compare antimatter has a negative 50% range penalty and a 20 thermal damage and 28 kinetic damage. Now, this is an important thing that we should talk about before we get any further, which is that all damage must be of a specific type. It must be either EM, thermal, kinetic, or explosive. And this is compared to the ship's individual resistances. We're going to talk about damage types more when we talk about tanks, but just for now, just know that damages have to be typed. And so this antimatter charge, every time it shoots, will do 20 thermal damage and 28 kinetic damage. And of course, that gets multiplied by both the turret's multiplication. So in this case, it would be multiplied by 8.558 or 4.41 base, but I have it upped by both the ship and my skills increase its damage. So that multiplies it. And then also my roll. Whatever I roll in my attack will make it do somewhere between 50% to 150% or even 300% of the total damage available. Antimatter is high damage, low range, whereas, and actually we can go here, remove this, put antimatter in, and then we can put some other charges in here. So as we can see, as range goes up, with iron having a plus 60% bonus and antimatter having a negative 50% bonus, as range goes up, damage goes down. That makes sense, which means hybrid ammo is a comparison of range versus damage. And the other thing to note is that all hybrid turret ammo does kinetic and thermal damage. And we can see exclusively it's going to do primarily kinetic damage and secondarily thermal damage. So what that means is that if you're fighting somebody who's using hybrids, you know exactly what kind of damage they're going to do, which means that you can protect against it, which is one of the weaknesses of what's called damage locked. Hybrid turrets are damage locked to kinetic and thermal damage. And so most of the differences between ammunition is simply range versus DPS. And crystals, lasers, are a lot the same way in the fact that we can take all of the crystals and we can set them up by range bonus. The other thing that's worth noting is that different blaster ammo require different capacitor. This is not as relevant when it comes to blasters as it is to lasers, because blasters take like half the capacitor as lasers. But it is true that different ammunition take more capacitor to run. This really comes into play when it comes to crystals, though. We see here that in the same sort of way, we have multi-frequency that does 50% range, negative 50% range bonus, and radio that's 60% range increase. The comparison between these two is actually very similar. In fact, we can go like this and we can see like it's a pretty much of a mix as it goes through, right? Antimatter, then multi-frequency, both are negative 50. Then these are both negative 37.5. So yeah, there's basically for each range difference, there is a crystal and a hybrid ammo. So they are pretty much the same in that regard. But remember, there's a big difference here, which is that lasers take no time to switch out ammunition, whereas hybrids do. With lasers, as I'm moving between these different range bonuses, I'm going to be switching out my crystals more frequently, because I can switch out a crystal instantly, but it takes 5 seconds to change out my ammunition in a blaster, for example. Changing ammunition with a blaster is much more of a consideration. In the same way that blasters are kinetic and thermal locked, so too lasers EM and thermal locked. So they'll do primarily EM and a secondary damage system of thermal. This means that 2 out of the 3 major turret systems do thermal damage. And in fact, if we look at the Entropic Disintegrator and the ammo that it uses, Entropic Disintegrators are locked to thermal and explosive. So of the turrets, 3 of the turrets are guaranteed to do thermal damage. That's something to keep in mind when it comes to tanking things. Armor is generally better at dealing with thermal than shields, but we'll talk about those kinds of nuances when we get there. The oddball out in all of this is projectile turrets. Projectile ammo is all over the place. So we're going to pull up the comparison tool again, and we see the range bonuses. Instead of each individual ammo type being a different range, we actually have only 3 ranges: plus 60%, 0 bonus, and negative 50%. So half range, normal range, 160% range. There is different tracking, with the better tracking being towards the middle, because the longer range doesn't need as much tracking. But the big difference here, though, that we can see is that projectile ammo do all different kinds of damage, which means with blasters, or with hybrids and with lasers, my only real consideration is, what is my optimal? When it comes to projectiles, you have to consider not only optimal, but also damage type that you want to use. With all that said, let's look at these charts again. We can see here that hybrid ammunition, disintegrator ammunition, and energy crystal ammunition, it's all the same damage types. We can see that each one is a certain percentage of EM and thermal, and they're mostly along this one axis. These ones that are below the axis, Conflagration, Scorch, Aurora, and the one that's above the axis, the Gleam, these are T2 ammo. We're going to talk about T2 ammo in a bit, but we'll notice that all of the normal T1 ammo is right down the center. However, if we go to projectile ammo, we will see that there's all different kinds of damage depending on what it is. However, projectile will always do some type of damage and kinetic, with a couple of them doing multiple types. And what we can see is we actually have clustered in 3 different chunks. We have chunk 1, EMP, fusion, phase plasma. Chunk 2, titanium, sabo, depleted uranium. And chunk 3, carbonized lead, proton, nuclear. What this means is that whereas with these other weapon systems, they have 8 different range profiles depending on which crystal you're using or which ammo you're using. With projectiles, they only have 3 real range profiles. But unlike the other ones, they get to choose their damage, which is a very interesting proposition. The EMP, the fusion, and the phase plasma all hit at the same amount of range for the same amount of damage, but the difference is that EMP does predominantly EM damage, fusion does predominantly explosive damage, and phase plasma does predominantly thermal damage. Likewise, in the high tracking mid-range system, we have titanium sabo that does mostly kinetic damage, and then we have depleted uranium that does almost even kinetic explosive thermal. And then for the long range, we have carbonized lead, which is mostly kinetic, proton, which is mostly EM with some kinetic, and we have nuclear, which is mostly explosive with some kinetic. So it takes a lot more understanding of what ammo to use the correct ammo when it comes to projectile weapons, but with that comes a lot of additional flexibility. It's also, remember that projectile ammo takes the longest of all of the ammo to reload. Whatever you stick with, you're kind of committing to that. It takes 10 seconds to reload a projectile weapon system. You may think, okay, well, I'm doing kinetic damage. I need to switch to EM damage. But is it worth 10 seconds of not doing any damage in order to switch to EM? That's the question. A couple of other caveats, I guess, is one other special thing when it comes to ammo, especially crystals. Crystals are very special. Whereas all of the other weapon systems require 1 round per shot. Each time the weapon system cycles, it consumes 1 round per turret. That makes sense. Crystals do not use rounds. They don't have rounds. Instead, they have durability. Now, these basic Tech 1 crystals that don't have anything fancy with these, the nice thing about these is that these will never break. These will last forever. The more advanced ones, the Tech 2 crystals, faction crystals, all these other special crystals, they will break eventually. And you can show info and you can see volatility is 100%, and volatility damage is 0.00025 HP. Every time it cycles, it does this much HP of damage. So based on that, you can figure out how many cycles it'll do before it gets broken. Just like mining crystals take damage as you cycle, so too do laser crystals work this way. So a faction crystal is assumed to get about 4,000 shots out of it before it breaks, whereas a Tech 2 crystal will get about 1,000 shots out of it before it breaks. But what this means is that while a lot of other weapon systems have to carry around a lot of ammo, laser systems just need to bring like a backup set of crystals and maybe even like a backup set of plain crystals. So that way, even if all of your other crystals break, you can always swap to these crystals and they will never run out. And so lasers have to carry a lot less space worth of ammunition. The other thing that's special about laser crystals is that if we sort this by range, we'll see that it goes red, orange, yellow, purple, green, blue, which means that one way to remember what the range systems of lasers is that it's in rainbow order. It's in this color spectrum order, from reds being the furthest range to blues being the closest range and multi-frequency being white being the absolute closest range. So that's one of the easiest ways to tell the difference. However, you can also tell the difference just by when you're undocked, you'll be able to right click on your turret to see what kind of weapon systems or what kind of ammo you have and what ranges they have. Let me find an example of that real quick. So this has 3 different kinds of ammo in it. We're going to undock real quick. And then if I right click on my turret, it shows me the 3 different ammo I have. And there's 2 pieces of information here. The one at the top is going to be my furthest range ammo, and the one at the bottom is going to be my shortest range ammo. So it's from longest to shortest. But then also we can tell what kind of damage types I do. So barrage does primarily explosive with a secondary of kinetic. EMP does primarily EM with a secondary of explosive. And hail does a primary of explosive and a secondary of kinetic. And we can double check this on the chart, and we can see barrage is here, the furthest range, mostly explosive, some kinetic. Back here is hail, which is mostly explosive, some kinetic. And EMP is mostly EM with some explosive and a little bit of kinetic. So it doesn't actually show the little bit of kinetic on here, but it is there. That is a quick way to kind of tell, even when you're undocked, to see which ammo you might want to switch to. Now, finally, when it comes to ammo, you have Tech 2 ammo. Tech 2 ammo is why Tech 2 is so strong. People talk about how like Tech 2 turrets are one of the biggest like train ups of Tech 2 in the game, but the difference is significant. If we look at here and we see fusion. Fusion is one of the Like here are all of the different ammo types again. Actually, this is going to be hard because it's all different types of damage. Let's go ahead and look for, let's go back to an Amar ship. Now, these are going to be small weapon systems when we've been looking at large weapon systems, so adjust your numbers accordingly. You can see here, the highest range damage weapon system is multi-frequency, which is a negative 50% range bonus and does a total of 12 damage, 5 thermal, 7 EM. With radio being the furthest range at 60%, doing 5 EM and 0 thermal damage. So we'll use microwave as our best example because that's 40%. That still does some thermal damage. So a total of 6 damage, right? If we compare that to Tech 2 ammo, Scorch has the same range as microwave, but instead of doing 6 damage, it does 11 damage, which remember, multi-frequency only does 12 damage. So this means that Scorch, at your almost maximum range, is doing as much damage as multi-frequency is, which is like your shortest range weapon system. That's how good Tech 2 ammo is. Scorch does as much damage as multi-frequency at significantly different ranges. Like, look at this. If I go, here I've got a range of 19 to 22, and I do 235 DPS. If I switch to multi-frequency, I'm doing 257 DPS, but I'm only doing it at 6 to 9 kilometers. So I'm doing slightly more damage, 20 more DPS, so 10% more damage, let's call it, just to be generous, but at a third of the range. So that's number one. And then likewise, I can always use the long range version of this, or sorry, the short range version of this ammo, which does 8.9 so 17 damage at the same range as multi-frequency. So significantly more damage than the shortest range ammo. If we open up the simulate again and we say, okay, well, if I have all multi-frequency in here, it does 257 damage and it has 6 to 9 optimal. With this, it increases to 381 DPS. Not quite double, but significantly higher for basically the same exact ranges. I think it is exactly the same ranges. So that is how big of a leap Tech 2 ammo is over Tech 1. That's not including the damage of the turrets itself. If we look at the actual necessity for Tech 2, we see that Tech 2 requires a specialization in that weapon system. You need to have the basic weapon system to 5, and then the specific weapon system, short or long range specialization, to at least 1. Now, this increases the amount of damage that the Tech 2 laser does, or the Tech 2 weapon does. But the biggest reason why you're wanting this specialization is to just unlock the ammo, which is why a lot of people just put it to 1, and then that just allows them to use the ammo at the very least. Getting it to 3 or 4 is much better because it increases your total damage when you're using Tech 2. But remember, you can use Tech 2 ammo in faction weapons. You don't have to use Tech 2 weapons. A good example of this is actually Triglavian ships. So if we simulate this thing and we give it an Entropic Disintegrator. I don't know why I did all this. All I was basically saying is that a lot of people use Vela's Entropic Disintegrators for various reasons. And because of that, Vela's Entropic Disintegrators can still use Tech 2 ammo. So the point of the matter is that Tech 2 ammo is significantly higher damage than Tech 1 ammo. However, there's a cost to this. Tech 2 usually means that it's specialized, which means it gives up something for something else. In this case, for most Tech 2 ammo, the thing that you're giving up is tracking. The thing that I don't have showing here, tracking speed multiplier. And if we switch this, we can see, oh, the 2 Tech 2 ship weapons, crystals, conflagration reduces tracking speed to 70% total, and the Scorch, the long-range one, reduces tracking speed to 75% of normal. 30% reduction for conflagration, 25% reduction for Scorch. And this is true across the board for short-range Tech 2 ammo. That's the other thing that is important to note with all of this. When it comes to Tech 1, it doesn't matter if you're using a short-range weapon system or a long-range weapon system. Both a medium blaster system and a medium rail system will both use medium hybrid skills. However, medium blasters will have their own specialization, and medium rails will have their own specialization. And likewise, medium blasters will have their own Tech 2 ammo, and medium rails will have their own Tech 2 ammo. In fact, there is a short and a long ammo type for each turret weapon system, both short and long range, which of course means with Triglavians, there's only 2 total because there's no long range Triglavian weapon system. There's only a shorter range weapon system, or well, I guess there's just the one. But so in this case, like with pulse lasers, Conflagration and Scorch are going to be your Tech 2 crystals. But if I had beam lasers, I would actually have, instead of Conflagration and Scorch, we have Aurora and Gleam. They use different crystals, or they use different bases in order to make the Tech 2, but there are 2 Tech 2 ammo for the short range, 2 Tech 2 ammo for the long range. So we have Conflagration and Scorch, and then for the beam laser, we have Aurora and Gleam. What's interesting about this is that we can see that the Aurora, which is the long-range weapon system, it has a range bonus of 80%. So it's the furthest of all of the weapon systems, right? It's even further than radio. Aurora is even further than radio and still does 8 damage per shot. So it does more damage than radio at further range, but it cuts your tracking to 0.25%. So it cuts your tracking by 75%. If they're moving, you're pretty much not hitting it. However, and this is what's interesting, the short range ammo, Gleam, increases your tracking by 25% to 1.25 times multiplier. What that means is that all of the Tech 2 ammo reduce your tracking, make tracking harder, make it harder to hit your enemy, except the short range ammunition or the long range weapon system. So the short range Tech 2 ammo for rails, Tech 2 ammo for beams, Tech 2 ammo for artillery, that short range ammo is going to increase your tracking rather than reduce it. So if we look back onto this chart, we can now fully understand what we're looking at here. And we can see that down here at the furthest range, we have Tremor, which is the Tech 2 long range artillery. It has the worst tracking, but the absolute furthest range. Right behind that is Barrage, which is the long-range short weapon system ammo, the autocannon weapon system. And so it's going to do a lot more damage. It's got 1.91 times the damage instead of 1.31 times the damage. But it's going to have not as bad tracking, but still pretty bad tracking. Then we have all of the normal long-range ammo systems that actually have a small bonus to tracking to them, just because it's projectiles, and projectiles are weird. And then you have the middle-range weapon systems, or ammo, that have higher tracking. And then you have the short-range weapon, or ammo, that have normal tracking. And you have Hail, which is your Tech 2 autocannon damage, so that's going to have lower tracking. But then you have Quake, which is your Tech 2 artillery short-range ammo, and that has a tracking bonus. Likewise, we see with the energy crystals, we can see Aurora down here as the Tech 2 long-range weapon system. Scorch is the Tech 2 short-range weapon system. Gleam is the Tech 2 long-range or short-range beam ammo. And so here it is up in the top left. So the reason why this is that effectively, if you have a long-range ammo weapon system and you load its short-range ammo for Tech 2, it's going to try to make it closer to the longest range for the short range weapon system, the longest range ammunition for the short range weapon system. So to put this into practicality, we jump back into our Praxis and we want to simulate. We're going to grab the Neutron Blaster Cannon and the 425 Railguns, the largest blaster battleship weapon and the largest rail battleship weapon. And what happens is if I come here, I can go null, put null into there, which is the long range Tech 2 ammo for the blasters. And I can put in Javelin, which is the short range railgun ammo. And what we'll see is this thing's optimal range is 13 to 30. The blaster's 13 to 30. The rails are 18 to 48. So they're not too far away from each other. And likewise, this thing has 67 damage per second, and these have 66 damage per second. So we can see if I take a blaster, if I take the short-range weapon system, and I load the Tech 2 long-range ammo in it, I have roughly the same effectiveness as if I have the long-range weapon system with the shorter range ammunition in it. Now, there is a couple of differences. First of all, you can see that the tracking on the blaster is still better. Twice as good or so, almost more than twice as good, with tracking of 4.87 versus 1.82. So it's not quite as good, but if you're trying to hit things with your railguns and missing, that difference of that long range or the short range ammunition in the long range weapon system, that extra tracking bonus is going to make it viable. Otherwise, trying to hit anything at 18 kilometers with railguns is going to be nigh impossible. So this bonus is helpful. If I had another kind of ammo in it, like if I had Spike, you can see my tracking is 0.36. So it's even worse, but I'm now hitting things at 130 kilometers for 38. So I'm doing about half the damage, but I'm doing it at 10 times the range. So, you know, there is that. And that's kind of how the relationship between Tech 2 ammo with its, not only how Tech 2 ammo interacts with your turrets in both damage and application. When I carry a standard loadout for a ship, what I normally try to do is I carry the short range and the long range Tech 2 ammo system. And then what I'll normally do is I'll carry the short range Tech 1 ammo system. For instance, in this battle cruiser I've got here with blasters, I'm only carrying short range weapons. So normally with this loadout, I would carry some null, some void, and some antimatter. So null is for when they're far away, void is when they're up close, and antimatter is for when they are smaller than me or I'm having difficulty hitting them. It is true that there are, like, if you're having difficulty hitting something, this is actually a trap that a lot of people fall into. They think, oh my God, Void does so much damage, 1,000 DPS. That's incredible. Whereas Cavalier and Navy Antimatter, you lose 200 DPS almost, switching from Navy Antimatter to Void. But the difference is that the Navy Antimatter is going to have a tracking of 66, and Void is going to have a tracking of 49. So if that's the difference between hitting and missing, then that Void isn't going to be doing much for you. And so Void is one of those things that, like, it does insane amounts of damage, but they require all near perfect condition to be able to actually apply that damage. So it's worth paying attention to your actual applied damage. And to that end, I'd like to recommend a tool for people to use. If you go back to the Notion, there's also a page called Essential Third-Party Tools, and there is a tool here, PyEve Live DPS. I'll put the link in the description down below. This tool, very cool. We call it Peld, and actually, if you in chat ever type in Peld, !Peld, then it should link it to you. And you can use Peld to track your live DPS as you go, and check to see whether or not any given change that you're doing is manifesting in the form of actual additional applied damage or not. Because Peld keeps track of your actual damage that you're doing and receiving. So it's cool for that. But I think that might about do it. Oh, one last thing to look into when it comes to these things. We've talked a little bit about all the different pieces. We talked about the turrets. We talked about the different kinds of turrets that are available, the different kinds of ammo that is available. Disintegrators use ammo the same as any other turret, but there's only one turret, so it only uses one ammo per shot. But otherwise, they're just like normal. It's just like normal charges. The disintegrators have 500 charges in their gun because they're not designed to run out in the middle of a fight, because that would also cause them to reset their ramp. So in theory, a fully loaded disintegrator can shoot for quite some time before having to reload. But otherwise, they are just the same as any other turret in that regard. Like, this topic is so hard to just like wrestle down into a short guide, but hopefully I got everything I needed to in order to explain turrets to you guys. We've been over the kinds of turrets. We've been over the kinds of ammunition and how it influences turrets. And one last thing I want to cover is some skills. If you go into your skills and go into gunnery are all of the skills that relate to your turrets. A couple skills that you're looking for. A lot of these skills here are going to be for specific weapon systems, right? Medium energy turrets, medium hybrid turrets, all that sort of stuff. Then there are the support skills that are important to call out. Control bursts reduce the capacitor needs of weapon turrets. Remember, this doesn't impact projectile turrets at all, and will mostly impact lasers and disintegrators, and to a lesser extent, hybrid turrets. So control bursts are one of the lowest priority utility skills to train for guns. Motion prediction increases tracking speed, so increases your application. Rapid fire increases your turret's rate of fire, which is just straight up damage. Sharpshooter increases optimal range, which again, remember, optimal range is not fall off, so this doesn't influence everything the same. So sharpshooter will help lasers more than they will help out projectiles, for example, because projectiles already have stupid short optimal ranges, and you basically never shoot at your optimal range anyways, whereas lasers have really long optimal ranges. So sharpshooter is going to influence that a lot more. Next, obviously, gunnery is an important skill. 2% rate of fire. Rate of fire is just more damage. Surgical strike, 3% bonus to all damage for all weapons turrets. A lot of people sleep on surgical strike. Do not sleep on surgical strike. It's just an extra 15% damage, just layered on top of everything. No, you don't even have to shoot any extra bullets for it. It's great. Trajectory analysis. So trajectory analysis is the opposite of sharpshooter, where sharpshooter does optimal, trajectory analysis does fall off. So once again, trajectory analysis is going to be more useful for, say, a Mimitar pilot than for an Amarr pilot, because they're going to be relying on their fall off a lot more. So yeah, I think that's it for the skills. It would be nice if they had an option in the menus to re-enable seeing the old radians per second stat. I agree. But I mean, it is what it is. I guess one other thing I'd like to point out, in order to get that tracking information, you'll want to open up your overview. I've actually long since said that I want angular velocity to be displayed on the locked target. You can see that on my overview, I have angular velocity being shown. You likely won't have it on yours by default. So the way to fix that is on the column that you want to add angular velocity to, you right click on it and then go to columns, and you can check angular velocity there, but you can also click change order. So that way you can check angular velocity, and you can click and drag it to move it up and down the list. The higher up the list, the further left it is. The further down the list, the further right it is. So if I drag it all the way to the top, boom, now angular velocity is my first column. If I drag it all the way to the bottom, then angular velocity goes to the right column. So you can put it where you want, and you can make it visible to you. That'll help, at least somewhat, be able to figure out your ability to hit them. Another way to do this is if you have your tactical overlay on, you should be able to see your own trajectory like this. And if you lock up another ship, yeah, you can see that there is their angle. You can see the arrow pointing that's flashing. It's a little bit dim, but that is their vector versus my vector. And so lining those vectors up is a really good way to reduce that transversal velocity. But I think that's going to be another discussion for piloting. This was it for turrets. Today we talked about the types of turrets, the ammo, the skills, and everything that you need to know exactly what kind of turrets you're going to be using and why you're going to be using turrets. You'll understand why your battleship is failing to hit that Nergal. And you know what? Here's a little bonus one. All that we talked about today explains one thing, or explains an interesting concept. So we come here, each race has their own turret systems. You expect the race to stick to that turret system. If you see a Galente ship, you'd expect it to see blasters or hybrid or rail guns. You'd expect to see hybrids on it. When you see an Amarr ship, you're going to expect to see lasers. However, think back to everything that we've learned today and realize that lasers cost a lot of capacitor and don't do that much more than any of the other weapon systems. So if you can get as much out of, say, projectile weapons as you can out of lasers, then why would you choose to use the capacitor over not capacitor? So the practical effect of this is the Punisher. We can see this Punisher here. This Soldier of Fortune Punisher uses Gatling modulated energy beams, beam weapons. We would expect that. That sounds right. That's what a Punisher should use, beam weapons. But this one, this official fit, the EVE Online Tutorials team fit for the Punisher, uses autocannons. Why would a Punisher, an Amarr ship, use autocannons? Well, the reason why is we can look at the actual Amarr ships, or this ship's bonuses, and we realize that its major bonus is a reduction to the capacitor cost of turrets, of energy turrets. What the Punisher does, their damage bonus, they don't actually have a damage bonus. They only have a capacitor bonus for energy turrets. So it makes it so that it can shoot the energy turrets with the same amount of capacitor. I can use these autocannons, and the fact that I don't have a bonus for these autocannons doesn't mean anything to me, because the bonus that's here is a cap bonus, and autocannons already use no cap. So if I add ammunition to this thing, let's say phase plasma, I'm going to do 69 DPS, nice. Whereas this Soldier of the Fortune is going to do 98 DPS. So it's going to do more damage, DPS, but the difference here is that this one doesn't take capacitor and has the additional advantage of being able to pick my damage type. Remember, lasers are stuck to EM thermal, whereas projectiles can do EM, thermal, kinetic, and explosive in different ratios depending on what you want to do. You'll often see, especially with Punishers, but you'll see this in a few other ships too, where if the Amarr ship doesn't have an explicit damage or rate of fire bonus for lasers and instead just has a capacitor, an activation cost bonus, you'll see people slap projectiles on it all the time. One last thing to note, which was just brought up by Ragtag. Thank you, Ragtag. One last thing to note when it comes to turrets is how to improve turrets. You can improve the ability to hit things with mid slots and low slots. The mid slot is the tracking computer. The low slot is the tracking enhancer. And you can enhance the damage, each weapon system having its own damage enhancement tool. Lasers have heat sinks. Railguns have magnetic stabilizers, projectiles have gyro stabilizers, and entropic disintegrators have radiation sinks. So you can see like magnetic field stabilizers will increase both damage and rate of fire, each one. Now these have stacking penalties. So those are going to increase your damage, whereas the tracking enhancer, tracking computer will increase your application. And then there are rigs. You can use rigs to increase your weapon fire. However, this is one of those edge cases. Sometimes you'll be given a fit. You won't be able to fit it, even though it seems like you should be able to fit it. Like, let's go ahead and look at this thing. We talked about CPU and power grid last time. Each one of these turrets takes CPU and power grid. Launchers use more CPU than power grid. Turrets use more power grid than CPU. There are rigs that will enhance your weapon systems. They are type specific, so we're going to need to use hybrid rigs for these hybrid weapons. And these rigs can affect all kinds of things. They can affect the optimal range, the fall off, your rate of fire, the amount of damage, all that kind of stuff. However, these are very heavy rigs to use. They take a lot of calibration to use, but they also have a drawback. And that drawback is it makes your turrets consume more CPU. No, it's most of the time power grid. Why is that one CPU? I'm dumb. It doesn't say CPU. I was looking at power grid and thinking CPU for some reason. Okay, so rigs, weapon rigs, will enhance those weapons, but at the cost of it taking additional fitting. So if we see that I switch into these two rigs, I now no longer can fit these turrets. Now, the reason why this is important, this is my tip for people that are not necessarily brand new, but this is for like step 2 people. People have been in the game for like a month to 6 months or so. You're going to get given a fit and you're not going to be able to fit it. And you're not going to be able to understand why necessarily, because you have all of the major fitting systems, but most people don't train rigging skills because you don't need rigging skills to fit rigs anymore. They just are used to reduce the drawback. For example, this drawback is 10%, but because I have skills, it's reduced to only 5%. So I can fit 2 of these rigs on before it blows out my power grid. If I did not have hybrid weapon rigging to 5, then just one of these rigs would blow out my power grid. So if you ever see a ship that you can't fit and you don't quite understand why, one of the very first things that you should check is the rigs, to see if one of the rigs is in fact a weapons rig, and then check your weapons rigging skill against that, because you might be able to train it for a level or 2 and have that be more effective than, training some other longer skill like Power Grid Operations 5 or something like that. You might be able to just train hybrid rigging 3 and get effectively the same effect, or just slap a Blinging Cybernetic and it'll be fine. So that's it. That is turrets. That's how they work. That's what kind of turrets there are. That's how ammo works with those turrets. It's how the skills and other things work with it. Yeah, so that is it. The complete information. You now understand turrets. Next time, we're going to be going into missile systems. However, I do want to note that people have said that they want me to get more, do more of the lore stuff. So while I will be doing more mechanical videos like this, I'm not going to prioritize them as much as I was going to originally. If you do want these kinds of videos, please make sure to like the video and comment on it. Unironically, it's not just for the algorithm. It's for me too. It helps me understand what kind of videos you guys need to have made first and foremost. So please like this video if it's been useful to you, if you've learned anything. Hopefully even experienced pilots managed to learn something today. Comment below if I missed anything, and I'll make sure to pin it and get it up there for people. And also make sure to comment with other things that you want me to cover. Next, I want to go over to missile systems and then shield systems after that. Hopefully this will be able to be cut down to be something useful to people. If you're watching this edited, please let me know if you liked it. I've been Ashtarothi. I've been playing this game since 2010, talking about since 2012, and I'm here to put even into context for you, my fellow periods. Thank you guys so much for watching. I especially appreciate all of you who have taken the extra choice to support the stream, either by becoming a member or a sponsor on Patreon. You're the reason why I'm able to do this. Yeah, I could fawn about it if I wanted to, but I'm just going to say that. If you want to consider becoming a member, you can get access to the emotes as well as edited videos early, and access to my supporter chat in Discord, where we talk about things that are coming up and people can suggest things to me and talk to me. If you are new to EVE, or if for whatever reason you haven't gotten your million free SP, if you're a returning pilot player or whatever, make sure to use the link down below or in chat, or get your free million skill points. That's 40 days of training as an alpha pilot for free. It helps out the stream if you do. And if you want to help maximize player engagement with EVE Online, you can come and join Convocation of Empyreans. We are here to have fun in EVE Online, and we would love to have you. So with all that said, I have been Ashtarothi, the voice of New Eden. Until next time, I'll see you in space.